we're talking about the year ahead. 2026 is going to be a really pivotal year for pro-Europeans. It marks 10 years since the referendum, and this week also marks 6 years since we actually left the EU. Over the past 12 months, we've seen more improvement to the relationship between the UK and the EU than we have in the past decade. The first UK-EU summit happens in May, and it's set to be an annual event. The UK will be rejoining Erasmus Plus in January of next year, which is obviously an incredible win. We've been campaigning on that for a very long time. And also the conversation about being part of the customs union and the single market is becoming much more positive, and things are really moving in a good direction. So this evening we'll be hearing from 3 speakers who will be sharing their thoughts and insights into what 2026 may bring to us pro-Europeans, and hopefully a little bit of hope and anticipation for that. So firstly, we will hear from David GAUKE, who is the former Secretary of State for Justice and a Conservative Member of Parliament, who was in Theresa May's cabinet. David is a long-standing advocate for pragmatic UK-EU relations and has continued to contribute to public debate on Brexit, constitutional reform, and the future direction of British politics. After that, we'll hear from Richard Baker, MP. He's the Scottish Labour Party politician, serving as the MP for Glenrothes and Mid Fife since 2024. Richard is a member of the UK's delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, and in fact, he is this evening joining us from Strasbourg, where he's fulfilling that role. And he's also an active participant on the APPG on Europe. And of course, NATALIE BENNETT is the former leader of the Green Party of England and Wales, also a member of the House of Lords. NATALIE is a prominent environmentalist, writer and campaigner, and a strong voice on European cooperation, climate action and social justice. So a big welcome to our guests this evening. Really thrilled to have such esteemed colleagues joining us. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to David GAUKE, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the year ahead for UK-EU relations.
Thank you, Emma, and very good to be with you this evening, and thank you for asking me to join you. I will address the subject matter, but before I do so, as some of you may be aware, Prosper UK was launched this week, and I should just say a word or two about that. Prosper UK is a new centre-right movement aimed at those who hold centre-right values and principles, and wanting to provide a forum for them, a voice for those people, and to demonstrate that the centre ground of British politics has not disappeared, as some would argue, and to influence the debate about our politics, our tone of politics and the substance of our politics, and in particular a focus on the economy. I mentioned that it's clearly relevant, I think, to today's discussion. I stress I'm speaking here on personal capacity, but I am a vice chair of Prosper UK. The particular focus of Prosper UK is on the economy and how we build a stronger economy than we've seen in recent years. And there are many factors that we will look at in that context. There's no doubt that our relationship with the European Union, the additional barriers to trade with the EU that have been put in place since Brexit is a factor in terms of the economic challenges that we have. There's no denying that. And any pragmatic government looking at the options of how to get the economy growing does have to look at the nature of our trading relationship with the EU. I want to stress that within Prosper UK, there are a range of views on Europe. Some passionately believe we should rejoin the European Union. Others would make the case for trying to make the existing relationship work and try to smooth some of the difficulties and so on. And we're a broad church. and that's as it should be. We are not wanting to be seen as a single issue organisation. We are not essentially a sort of conservatives for the European movement as such. But I do believe that as a group, we are pragmatic, and we will want to be evidence-led, and we will want to look at ways in which we can strengthen our economy. And Brexit is undoubtedly an issue. And we want to influence the Conservative Party. How much the Conservative Party will want to be influenced, we shall see. But I do think it is important that there is a voice for those who are on the centre-right, who believe in a more pragmatic relationship with the European Union, and Prosper UK, amongst other things, will provide that voice. And if there are people who are listening to this and are supportive of our values, then you can just sign up as a supporter of Prosper UK. Go to the prosperuk.com website, and it's very easy to sign up as a supporter, and many thousands of people have already done so. So I'd urge you to do that. Now, that was the spiel, the advert that I wanted to get in. But in terms of the question, what the year ahead holds, I think, Emma, you're absolutely right to say this is going to be a significant year. I have no doubt that when we get to around about June the 23rd of this year, there is going to be a very vibrant debate about Brexit. Has it worked? What are the lessons of the last 10 years? And it is going to be a high-profile matter. And I think there are some factors that are moving public opinion towards a more pro-European position than was the case 10 years ago. Clearly, there are very few people are looking at Brexit and seeing that there are tangible benefits in that. We hear arguments about, well, we're getting these free trade deals with other parts of the world. Well, perhaps the most significant one was with India, but in recent days, the EU has also reached a trade deal with India, and as far as I can see, it is deeper and more extensive than the UK-India trade deal. There are also clearly genuine difficulties with our with our trading relationship with the EU, and that is manifesting itself in many ways in our economy. I think geopolitically, there's clearly been we are in a pretty difficult position given President Trump and his approach to a whole range of matters. And yes, the UK has negotiated perhaps a better trading relationship, or been spared tariffs compared to the EU, but we have had a lesson in recent days about how fragile that is, and the whim of the president could mean that anything that we thought we had achieved could be lost. And indeed, some of the things that we had thought we had agreed aren't necessarily being implemented in the context of the tech deal. So all of that, I think, is playing into a shift of opinion. There's obviously a demographic factor that people joining the electoral register tend to be more pro-European than those who are leaving the electoral register. And it is no great surprise that this is becoming a live debate. Now, others are better qualified to talk about what is going on in the left of politics and whether there is a dynamic there that, particularly after the May elections, might mean that there is a livelier debate about the European Union and the nature of our relationship with it. I would not be at all surprised to see that happening. But I think what is important, this is where I come back to Prosper UK, is that if we are to have a debate about the nature of our relationship with the European Union, and my judgment in terms of where public opinion is it recognises that Brexit, most people recognise that Brexit was a mistake, but aren't filled with enthusiasm for going through everything that would be involved in terms of a substantial change in the relationship at the moment. Nonetheless, there is a recognition that there are problems that need to be solved, and there should be pragmatism, I think, on all sides of the political debate and a recognition that it is in our interest economically and geopolitically to build a stronger relationship with our closest trading partner, that there is scope for much greater military cooperation. That doesn't necessarily mean, by the way, that has to be done through the European Union as an organization, but nonetheless, with other European nations, we need to strengthen that relationship. And it is time to look again at not necessarily the final decision that was made, but to look again at whether we can build a stronger relationship. A lot of progress has been made in recent months. I think the government is trying to do this quite quietly, but I wrote some time ago, before the last election, that I thought that the 2024 election, nobody really wanted to talk about Europe. It may well be by the time we get to the 2029 election, it may become a much bigger divide. At one level, I worry about that because I fear that the Conservative Party, which I'm a member, will find itself taking a position that may be at odds with the majority of business opinion. I hope that isn't the case, but I think that is a possibility. But as I say, I think this is going to be a fascinating year. We are likely to see movement towards a closer relationship. And I think in the summer, there's going to be quite a lively debate about Brexit. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That's really interesting to hear. And I'm really glad you also think that there will be a lively and vibrant debate happening in June, because here at the European Movement, that's very much what we're planning on doing and being a major part of. So we'll be hopefully sharing more plans about that a bit shortly. But yeah, absolutely, it really is time to be talking about that closer relationship between the UK and the EU and making progress, given all the points that you raised. So thank you very much. We'll hand over now to Richard Baker, MP, who is quite topically and interestingly joining us from Strasbourg. He is a member of the Parliamentary Assembly for the Council of Europe. So not only is he on the benches at Westminster, he is also regularly a visitor of Strasbourg, which is excellent. So Richard, over to you. Would be great to hear your side of things.
Thank you, Emma. Good evening, everybody. Good evening from Strasbourg. And thank you to the European Movement for inviting me to take part in this discussion, but also for everything the organisation does to promote positive dialogue and engagement between the UK and our European counterparts, both domestically and internationally as well. So as Emma said, I'm a member of the APPG on Europe, and also I'm a member of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Select Committee, where we've had a role in scrutinising the work of Nick Thomas-Symonds as Minister for European Relations and his team in progressing our negotiations with the European Union through the summit last May and ahead of the summit later this year. And I think I'd characterise the progress we've made in renewing our relationship with Europe as very positive. And I believe for our economy, and certainly for businesses in my constituency in Fife, this has been vital given our £800 billion trading partnership with the EU. And indeed, the OBR now says Brexit caused a 4% long-term reduction in our GDP. So we can't afford not to break down trading barriers with Europe created by Brexit wherever we can. And the evidence of the more positive relationship is a regular dialogue with the EU and summits, which were not a feature of the trade and cooperation agreements process, and the outcomes too, which we saw from the summit in May. So on SPS and agri-food, with ministers hoping to have that deal concluded at the summit this year and operational in 2027, this will be a huge boost to our trade in food and drink and to our agricultural sector, ending wasteful and costly red tape for the industry. We've made progress too towards an agreement to link our emissions trading system with Europe and reintegrating the UK into the EU's electricity market. And again, this presents huge opportunities for British business. And the government estimates that between SPS and the emissions trading scheme linkage, this will add £9 billion to our GDP by 2040. So these economic advantages from building on this work, renewing our relationship with the EU, they're self-evident. But the benefits are not just about the economy, they're about security and they're about culture too. And in what I think was a difficult year in politics, for me, one of the chinks of light came with the announcement that we will rejoin Erasmus Plus, restoring opportunities for young people to train and study abroad with other education professionals as well, and with negotiations continuing towards a new youth experience scheme, so young people of the UK from all backgrounds can have that experience of studying and working in the EU and provide labour mobility in the UK as well. But of course, it was never going to be the case that we could achieve all we wanted to in forming our new relationship with Europe in just 1 year. And there are still very challenging areas for the negotiations which will take place this year. The government's made clear we want to reach an agreement to remove barriers for touring artists in the EU, and it looks like we've some way to go to achieve this objective. And also at the end of last year, negotiations broke down on UK participation in the EU's SAFE programme for defence industrial cooperation. And I hope progress can still be made in this area ahead of what will be a crucial summit later this year, because the need for closer cooperation with Europe on security and defence is absolutely clear. I also believe this has been a positive in the government's engagement with the EU, as the Prime Minister has played an important role of leadership in bringing together the coalition of the willing for Ukraine, so Europe can show its determination to support Ukraine and not accept any peace deal which rewards Putin for his brutal aggression. And of course, on Greenland, Britain has shown on a cross-party basis, I think it's fair to say, that we will stand shoulder to shoulder with Denmark and Greenland, along with our European NATO partners. And as I'm taking part in this webinar from Strasbourg, I can tell you we have been debating these issues at the Council of Europe over the past few days. And while there are a range of diverse views across the Parliamentary Assembly here, there's an overwhelming consensus and a sense of urgency that with so many spheres of conflict in our world today, and with the norms of international law being tested in ways which are unprecedented, European nations must work more closely together to face these shared challenges. So I think over the next year, there will certainly be some set piece events which will be vital for the UK and for Europe. We don't know when it will be, but we'll have the next summit. We'll have the G7 summit as well. But I think for all of us recognize how important building closer ties with Europe is, we'll have some major political battles ahead at home as well, as David pointed to. And this is something I'm seized by while I'm here in Strasbourg, where we're likely to have further political statements on the impact of the European Court of Human Rights rulings on migration, at a time when in the UK we have a growing consensus on the right of politics that we should actually withdraw from the ECHR. Those of us who believe in the importance of the ECHR for human rights across the world will have a fight on our hands. We've got a bill coming to Parliament on regulatory alignment with the EU, and we must hope that the debates on that legislation won't provide us with too many awful flashbacks to the parliamentary debates in the aftermath of Brexit. And of course, we'll have vital elections across the UK, including national elections in Scotland and Wales, where reform will undoubtedly seek to profit electorally by peddling myths about our relationships with the EU. So after progress last year in renewing our relationships with Europe, we have many challenges ahead this year. But with more and more people recognizing the damage Brexit's done and the case for European cooperation never stronger and never more evident, those of us who believe in continuing our journey towards closer collaboration with Europe can state our case with confidence.
Brilliant. Perfectly on time, Richard. That was excellent. Thank you so much for your contributions. Obviously, it's been an incredibly busy year, and there's another incredibly busy year scheduled. So it's really fantastic to see the progress that has been happening since the change of government. So all this is really positive, but exactly as you say, some of it has been fueled by a real big change in the geopolitical sort of reality of the world. And I think we're all dealing with the fact that how countries work together over the past sort of 70, 80 years even is not how the world is working anymore. So it's really great to hear your input from that. So thank you very much. Of course, although economic cooperation, security and defence cooperation are incredibly important, it doesn't stop there. Environmental cooperation is something that the UK used to be a leader in when we were members of the European Union. And I'd like at this stage to bring in NATALIE BENNETT, who, of course, a Baroness in the House of Lords, former leader of the Green Party of England and Wales. And I'm sure you have some brilliant insights to share with us this evening on the topic. So over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Emma, and thank you very much to the European Movement for organising this and inviting me along. And particularly thank you to all of the hundreds of people who've come along and dedicated an hour of their Thursday evening. I've got a saying that what we need is a world where everyone makes politics what they do not have done to them, and you're doing politics this evening. So thank you very much for that. Just very briefly to set out, some people may not know where the Green Party starts on all of this. We are unequivocally committed to renewed UK membership of the European Union. But while we're not in that situation, we basically want to stay as close as possible to EU rules and regulations cooperating together, which will make that easier. And for reasons I'll get to, we'll also have many other advantages. And you said I'm in the House of Lords. One of the things that I hear very often, the House does, you can almost hear the groan that runs around the House when some of our Northern Ireland members, we've got another fatal motion, regret motion related to the Windsor Agreement. And I did do a fascinating debate at one stage talking about mercury fillings in teeth. And there was a whole complicated issue around the Windsor Agreement and the behaviour of dentists and fillings, which is just one sign of the kind of problems that Brexit has created, particularly for people having to work across Great Britain. But you asked me particularly to focus on environmental matters. And actually, Richard's already spoken a bit about climate emissions trading, some of those climate areas. When I'm talking about environment, people sometimes are surprised when they say, should we just focus on climate? And I go, no, absolutely not. My focus is on planetary boundaries. Stockholm Resilience Centre identifies 9 planetary boundaries. We've already exceeded 7 of them. And one I particularly focus on is what's known as novel entities, for shorthand, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, plastics, and other chemicals. And there's just a really interesting case study in the last 24 hours. The Financial Times is reporting that the European Commission is considering a complete ban on PFAS, the so-called forever chemicals, the pollution levels of which are rising, and there's very serious health concerns in terms of children, babies' development, and in terms of cancer and other health effects. Now, the European Commission is thinking about banning them. Last night, after a huge amount of effort working with crossbencher Baroness Boycott, we extracted from the Minister a promise that they'll think about encouraging them not being in school uniforms in the UK anymore. And these are chemicals that are absorbed through the skin. So the whole area of chemicals regulation is a really nice case study of a much broader issue that we have on chemicals regulation fallen well behind the EU. That has real implications for human health and environmental health, the One Health perspective that I work from. And if we line up again with the EU in many of these areas, we just don't have the capacity in our government to deal with these issues. And we can start to catch up again on things that have real impacts on environmental health and human health. Now, I think also, for me, the Brexit was about so much damage being done to people. And I talk a lot to schools, colleges and universities and say to all of them, young people, I'm really sorry. I apologise on behalf of my generation. You've got fewer freedoms and opportunities than your parents had because of Brexit. Now, Youth Mobility Scheme is going to be hopefully a big step forward. That's a positive sign. But we need to go much further than that, definitely looking eventually towards freedom of movement. And also, I mean, also in the House of Lords, the Earl of Clancarty is very much our leader, with some other of the crossbench peers, on the huge issues that creative sector people, artists, musicians, etc., have encountered. And, you know, I never would have expected to spend so much of my time talking about cabotage and the issues of trying to actually get your specialist lorry that's fitted out for all of your musical instruments to get it through 5 European countries, which is just about impossible. You know, I hope our government will make some real strides on that. It's difficult because it's hard to currently operate anything but a country by country basis, but hopefully we can see some real improvements in that. I also think there's a real concern with the hostile environment in the Home Office, which I'm afraid, contrary to some people's hopes and expectations, has hardly improved at all. I think we're going to see continuing stories about problems that European citizens particularly are encountering in the UK. We have so many people who have blended families going across what's now the Brexit border, and the problems they're going to encounter with the Home Office, with immigration. We're just going to see a continual torrent of those kind of problems, which is really concerning. And you'd hope the government will take some more steps to deal with some of those at a structural level, rather than having to have one person put in an impossible situation, then eventually rescued after a lot of media and campaigning effort. And finally, I think I'm going to apologise in advance. No one has actually used the T word yet, but I am going to say Donald Trump. And of course, one of the reasons why we have seen a real change in the past year, and, you know, I was actually at a meeting last night with 2 MEPs who were asked to predict what Europe would look like in 2030. So much does depend on what Donald Trump does. And I'm afraid some people seem to be particularly, Trump has said once in one sentence that no, he's not going to invade Greenland. That's what he said one day. Who knows what will happen the next day? And we do have to think very hard about defence cooperation, working with our European neighbours. We can't rely on old arrangements, old certainties, as the Green Party has long been saying. And we've really got to think about the people of Ukraine, you know, right at this moment, suffering such horrendous attacks from Russia. And the security of us all. Security means food security. It means a whole range of other issues. It means we've got to think about how we're actually cutting back on diplomacy, and that's a real problem. The cuts back to the FCDO, it mightn't be the most popular political issue. It's not easy to say, hey, let's support our diplomats, but we actually need really strong diplomats. We need really strong language skills, all of those things that Britain really needs to be strong in, that we really haven't, we've actually been cutting back on, that really is a problem. So I think, you know, what ultimately this is about is rebuilding links that were severed, relationships that we've cut off through the process of Brexit. That requires a change in attitude. We have seen a significant move from the government in the last year under the pressure of Trump, and under the pressure, of course, the cost of living crisis, and, you know, very good figures from the London School of Economics. Food prices are 6% higher than they would be without Brexit. I also work a lot with the Horticultural Trade Association, the environmental horticulture people. They still have enormous border problems. There's a lot to do, but I always focus on hope, and so I'm being hopeful that we can make some real progress in the next year. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Natalie. And I'm great we ended on a hopeful note. I think we're all a little bit short on the commodity at the moment. So, yeah, and I absolutely agree that ultimately everything boils down to people, and the damage done to people is probably one of the most heartbreaking parts of having left the EU. So, yeah, it's really important to always remember that that's where it ends and where people feel it the most. So thank you so much to our contributors. I believe we have some really interesting questions that have come through on the chat. So we'll be moving to those. You can use the chat function to submit your questions, and we'll be selecting a few. We've had quite a lot, so I don't think we'll be able to get through all of them, but of course we will try and do it. So first of all, Caroline Hager is asking Richard, as you're in Strasbourg, what are your European colleagues saying about the UK cooperation with the EU and rejoining in the future?
Thank you, Caroline. I saw there were a number of questions along the same theme, so thank you to all those who've posed that question. I mean, here in Strasbourg, certainly in terms of closer working between the UK and our European colleagues, I think people are seized by the need to move forward in terms of renewing that cooperation, to have closer cooperation with the international challenges which we face. And that's been a real theme of all the discussions we've had here in terms of Greenland, in terms of Ukraine, which is frequently discussed here at the Council of Europe. And, you know, there are a range of views. There are also representatives of far-right parties here as well. But the vast majority, I think, of people are seized by the fact that now more than ever, we have to work together as Europe. And, you know, the UK just has to be part of that if we're going to be an effective alliance. In terms of rejoining, I think, you know, here in Strasbourg, the debate's been focused about here and now and where we're at with these really pressing international issues and the tragedies of loss of human life which they involve. And so that's been a focus. But when I was last in Brussels, what I found there was speaking to MEPs was, you know, firstly, a real sense that there was a real change in terms of the mood around the relationship. There was much more positive, I think, positivity in that relationship. And when you speak to MEPs, actually, you know, and I remember asking this question myself, you know, what would be the chances of us being, you know, of getting back in if we wanted to, thinking you might get some real pushback on that. And at that level anyway, you know, on the MEP level, people are saying, look, we'd love Britain to be back in. Now, of course, this is all way off in the future. There's so many other considerations to have, but as David was saying, maybe this sort of thing will come more on the political agenda in future elections. But I think that the way that we are moving forward and looking at a more positive relationship is certainly having that improving that discussion around working more closely together.
Great, thank you. And I'm sort of interjecting an additional question. Really, was an understanding of how far up or down the agenda sort of the UK being part of the EU is in Europe, because I think previously it probably was really low and that they were really sort of, like you say, focusing on the here and now. Do you think that the advent of Trump and the change of geopolitics has maybe increased that likelihood, or is it something that they're a bit less likely to consider?
I think, and we would also be a bit realistic about this, about in the aftermath of Brexit and the pain that EU went through as well. You know, it's actually, when we went out to Brussels, hard to, you know, to kind of get an idea that, you know, the negotiations for us with the EU, which are vital, actually they weren't that high up on their agenda, in all honesty, you know, because they were dealing with so many other issues, including other international trade deals which they are pursuing. But I do think that the where we're at now with the, you know, with what's happening in America in terms of, you know, decisions which threaten the norms around international law, there is focusing minds. And I think, you know, whether it goes as far as membership, Emma, that's a whole other debate. But in terms of working more closely together on these issues right now, I think that's moving in a very much more positive direction and up the agenda.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Richard. I think moving on to the next question, I think we have a question about China. So yeah, Owen Morgan, I'm going to ask David GAUKE hopefully to come in on this one, although it is a question about the government, so you may not be able to answer directly. Why is the government prioritising closer relations with China above seeking to take us back into the EU?
Well, I'll have a stab, and obviously I'm no spokesperson for the current government. I think if they were here, what they would say, and maybe Richard would sort of comment on this, it isn't so much a question of prioritising. It is just that removing trade barriers is good for an economy, and one should try to do that where one can. And clearly, Europe is a more important market to us than China. But China is still the second biggest economy in the world, and depending on how you measure it, you could argue it's the biggest, but essentially it's the second biggest economy in the world. And if you can make progress on that, then that can contribute towards lowering costs and raising living standards. The one thing that I do find rather curious in the debate over China, if I can perhaps look briefly at my own side, if you like, my own tribe of the Conservative Party, is that some of those who were most enthusiastic 10 years ago for leaving the European Union so that we could look elsewhere and trade with other parts of the world that were growing more quickly, are very often the same people who say, but we can't have anything to do with China. And I can understand why there are reservations about the Chinese government and their behavior on a whole range of issues. But I do think it is somewhat odd to argue, to essentially argue that we turn our back on Europe and look to the rest of the world and then quickly follow it by saying, but we should have nothing to do with the second biggest economy in the rest of the world. I don't think that makes sense.
Thank you, David. I wonder if Richard agrees from a governmental point of view. Is there anything?
David's given a better answer on behalf of the government than I probably. But what I know, I think he's right. I think it's. I think we see Canada do the same thing. And we are living in a world where traditional relationships are being strained, and so you have to build relationships with other countries and economies too. But certainly not prioritizing China over our relationships with Europe. And David's also, of course, right to raise human rights in these discussions with other countries. Those issues around human rights can't be left off the table when we have those discussions.
Absolutely. Definitely. Thank you, Richard. So I think we have a question about Creative Europe. So I think I'm going to ask Natalie about this, seeing as how you mentioned the creative sector already. So how do things stand with regards to the UK being part of Creative Europe, which can potentially provide a lot of support to UK citizens in all areas of the creative industries?
Well, I entirely agree with the direction of travel. And I mean, what we've seen is with austerity, particularly affecting local councils, regional arts across the UK, but of course, all of our arts sector, things have been absolutely slashed away. And it's one of the things that you really notice when you go to continental Europe is how much visibly, obviously, better funded the creative sectors are. One of my pet subjects is how much you see public art in all kinds of areas in Europe. And we have a huge paucity of public art in so many communities that could so enrich our lives. So I'd very much be in favour of that. I can't speak for the government, and I must admit that I'm not quite sure whether our government could quite cope with that. You look at what Creative Europe talks about doing is challenging boundaries. And when you go into some of those European museums, some of the projects funded by Creative Europe, they are, by British standards, pretty edgy stuff. Whether our current government, with its sort of general political inclinations, would be comfortable with embracing that, I don't know. I would very much hope so. And I think one of the things to say more broadly than that, and this is part of the whole Erasmus Plus story, as well as funding for creative sector, is there is a whole intellectual sphere that's just very, very Anglo, English language. And it's when you venture outside that sphere, and my next book, one of the things I get into is philosophical ethology, which is something that there's only a limited amount in English. There's a great deal more written, particularly in French and Italian, and we really need more. I'm afraid I'm not lining up with David here. I think centrism is dead because we need radical change in our societies. And one of the things that has to be behind that is lots of different ideas, fresh ideas, 21st century ideas for the Anthropocene post-financial crash. And so all of those things, we really need to be getting our culture, our universities, our thinking, our political culture enriched by all of those ideas coming in. But, not everyone's going to be comfortable with that, I'm afraid.
Great, thanks, Natalie. I'm sure we can shake some things up, definitely. But I'm keen on doing some more creative things in the world, definitely. So I hope I've frozen. No. So thank you very much. Our next question, Kenny Gilchrist. Will Scotland, as an independent nation state, be part of the EU as a member state before the rest of the UK? I can imagine that's a very difficult one to answer. I don't know, Richard, whether you have an opinion on this. The European movement, obviously, we think that the UK as a whole should be part of the European Union. Whether that is together or not is a decision up to Scotland. So, Richard, what's your view?
Thanks. Clearly, these are extremely hotly contested issues in Scotland itself. I understand that Kenny will be posing it because clearly in Scotland we did have a vote by most Scots to stay in the EU as opposed to the rest of the UK, and Kenny and I will share an ambition for far closer integration between Scotland and the EU as well in the future, but my obvious preference for that is that should be within the UK. So Kenny and I will not agree on that. I imagine if I was to be provocative, I'd say that Brexit doesn't offer a great example of the impact of breaking off from your biggest trading partner. But what I can say is, in terms of, I look to what coalitions we can build for support for closer work with Europe, closer ties with Europe across the chamber in Parliament. And what I can say is I've been working closely with Stephen Gethins, who is an MP for the SNP, who's also an extremely expert member of the APPG and very informed on European issues. And we do have working across the APPG and across the floor with my colleagues in Scotland from other parties who want Scotland to benefit from, as well as the UK, from having closer ties with Europe. I recently met with the Scottish Government's team in Brussels, who work closely with their Brussels counterparts there and with their UK counterparts on a whole range of issues. And I think it's also, Kenny's question reminds us, Emma, that in taking forward these negotiations, the interests of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland are crucial as well, and it is vital ministers work closely with the devolved administrations and those negotiations too. So I'm not going to be tempted into a crystal ball on this, but I do think that those of us who want to have closer ties with Europe, should try and do what we can to work across party boundaries to achieve the goal.
Completely agree. And obviously at European Movement, we are cross-party and we work with as many of our members across all the political spectrum, absolutely. So yes, thank you very much, Richard. I think we have a question on defence. So how can we contribute further to the defence of European lands and communities? Does any one of our speakers want to speak on that directly? Natalie, please.
Well, I think I've already made some reference to this, and I think at the moment we're seeing a number of European leaders leading the way in being really realistic about President Trump's America and the state of the US. And of course, Mark Carney has also been notably realistic from Canada in that basis. But it's really important that we have to acknowledge that the world has enormously changed. And for example, I was, as one is, at the Army's Land Warfare Conference and talking to some people running projects that are trying to ensure they're creating essential military materials that are 100% European in the broader sense, so including us. And there's going to need to be serious cooperation and serious thinking about the sustainability of our defence systems. And things like we have to think about our fragility as a society, security of the underwater cables on which our financial sector is enormously dependent, and indeed just our daily lives are enormously dependent. The security of our satellites. One of the things I learned a couple of years ago, which was quite shocking, is that all of our traffic lights, the timing is done via satellite. So if you lost the satellites, all the traffic lights would go. So we've really got to think about the resilience of our society against all kinds of threats. We are in an age of hybrid warfare, and this is the age we're in, and that's something that very much requires cooperation across Europe.
Just to add to that, look, I think it is a really important question. Clearly, we do have to live in a world where President Trump is not going to. It means that the US is not an ally that we can rely on to the extent that we have done, and you could make an argument that it's never going to be the case that we could always rely on the US, who have been subsidizing the defense of Europe for decades. That raises issue about expenditure, but also we need to get the best value for money as we possibly can, and we can have a more efficient defence of Europe if there is cooperation between European countries. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that doesn't necessarily mean that the institution of the European Union is the right institution here. There may well be other ways in which this should work. I'd be nervous about our defence being terribly dependent upon Viktor Orban, for example. But that sense of practical cooperation with other European countries, whether at a bilateral level or some wider organisation, is going to be really important. And whoever is in government is going to have to face up to that and recognise that a lot of our interests are very closely entwined with other European countries.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for both your contributions. Obviously, we're in unprecedented times, as we have been for many years already. So it's quite a change to the new world order. So thank you. I think we have another question. How can we combat the rise of reform? I think this is a question that many people are trying to tackle in different ways. I think, David, as you're on the screen, I'll maybe go to each of you and see if you have different answers. That would be an interesting thing to do. So, David, I think you've spoken a little bit about this already, but how do you think we could combat the rise of reform?
Yeah, I think there's a few things to be said. I think to the extent that, let's use the phrase, mainstream politicians can focus upon issues like the economy, and reforming public services, the, if you like, bread and butter issues that affect people's daily lives, the more they can do that, the better. That does mean taking practical steps to address some of the concerns that the public has about immigration running out of control, about stopping illegal immigration. That's not to say these are non-issues. They are serious issues and should be addressed. But that should provide the space for focusing back on those practical bread and butter economy and public services issues. And I think that's really important. And I think there has to be a willingness to take on reform and expose some of the dangers of populism. And if you have a populist such as Nigel Farage, the uncertainty this creates, the barriers to trade he has already contributed to, but the uncertainty it creates for investors in this country when he has policies that could be very disruptive, when economic institutions are at risk. I think it's important that we do that. And I do think there's a particular responsibility for those of us who are on the right of centre to say that, you know, he isn't really just like the Conservatives, but more so, even though he's attracted a lot of ex-Conservatives to his party, that the populist right is a very different creature to the traditional centre-right. But I think the traditional centre-right needs to make that argument, and that's what those of us involved with Prosper UK will want to do.
Thanks, David. Natalie, I would love to hear what your opinion is on the rise of reform.
Well, I think one of the important things is that we need the largest parts of mainstream politics to genuinely stand up to reform, particularly on issues such as immigration and discrimination, and issues on which we've far too often seen what are seen as mainstream politicians making bows towards trying to win over reform voters by sounding just pretty well like reform, but just not quite as bad. And I'm afraid that is a disastrous strategy and approach. The answer is to stand up to them and say they're wrong and there is an alternative. But there is also important to acknowledge that why did we lose, excuse me, the referendum in 2016? The slogan that won it was "Take Back Control." And far too many people and communities didn't feel in control of their own lives, their own economic futures, their own children didn't have control of their futures. So what we actually have to do is strengthen our society. And, tying back to the previous defence question, one of the things that we are seeing some people saying, and particularly people on the far right saying, and people who should know better across the political spectrum saying, oh, well, we're going to have to spend money on defence, so that means we're going to have to cut back on social programs. And that is so playing into the hands of the far right. And it's what we need to give people a secure, certain future where they have their own sense of agency. The person who I hold responsible, or at least the current that I hold responsible for many things, is Francis Fukuyama and the proclamation in the 1990s of the end of history. So people were told that this is the system we have and it's the system we're always going to have, and your only role as a voter is to choose who's going to run things. We have to restore people's faith that they can have agency, have a say as a voter, can change the things they don't like about their lives and communities now. And if you don't have that, then it leaves space for scapegoats to be blamed for why things are such a mess. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks, Natalie. Richard, what's your take on the rise of reform?
I think the rise of reform is partly because people are frustrated with the mainstream parties. They feel let down. We have to offer a bit more hope in our politics. We have to offer a clear vision for the future and a clear vision for a Britain where wealth is shared more equally and more people, more communities feel more prosperous. I mean, ironically, it is reform who took us out of the EU which made this country poorer. So I think we do have to remind people that if they're not feeling particularly prosperous, it's actually Farage and his allies have got something to do with that. And it's interesting, isn't it? We've got more and more people recognising Brexit was a mistake at the same time as reform are on the increase. There must be some opportunities here for us to scrutinise reform more, to hold them to account on the policies, for example, in health services, which would be catastrophic for many people in this country, particularly some of those people in the poorest communities, where actually, again, the reform are actually winning votes. But we also have to do so much more to tackle misinformation, disinformation. Reform are thriving on the back of social media, of a far too unregulated area of debate and information, with people being driven, algorithms driving misinformation to people. I think that has to be challenged, and that's why I think all of us have highlighted this in our different comments. We all have to work together to make the case for a more progressive and sensible approach to politics in this country.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Richard. What is interesting on reform is we've seen some polling that actually up to about 30% of reform voters, or people who may consider voting for reform, actually do support closer relationships with the EU. So it's not as cut and dried as it was in 2016. It is quite a complex picture in that, but yeah, it's quite a strange thing to be able to hold those two facts in your head at the same time. But there are definitely quite a number of people that do think that way. I think we have another question. This is about I think the APPG. So Liz Mills asking the next meeting of the UK PPA, so that is the Parliamentary Partnership Assembly, which is between the UK and the EU, is in mid-March and is expected to have a local and regional government perspective on the TCA and its agenda. Is the APP on Europe seeking local government evidence? Richard, as you're involved in the APPG?
Yes, I mean, certainly, I think we have to. So, I mean, I certainly hope we reach out to LGA and others to ensure that we do have the evidence we need from local and regional government about how we approach that process as well. So, I'm not, I certainly think that's something we need to take back to the officers of the APPG as well. I mean, it's a huge job the APP's got. We've talked about that all we need to do in terms of bringing a whole range of organisations, a network of civil society, business, and also every tier of government in terms of the work to understand what we need to do to achieve better and closer links with Europe and local government, and also mayoralties have a vital role as well. I was speaking about devolved governments in Wales and Scotland earlier on. It's absolutely vital for local authorities too. So I think Liz has made a really important point which APPG needs to act on.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. We're coming close to our time, so I think we'll have one last question before we go, and then we'll be wrapping up after that. So a big question from Joy. What would EU membership cost the UK? I think that's up for negotiation, but let's maybe start with Natalie, who's nodding along. Natalie, what's your view on that?
Well, I was nodding to your it depends on negotiations answer, but I think that it's a little bit like I'm often talking about a new supermarket's coming into town, and they say, hey, we're going to create 150 jobs, and we're going to grow the local economy. What they don't talk about is how many jobs they're going to destroy in all of the small independent businesses that are forced to close down when people drive to the out-of-town supermarket. Mm-hmm. So, I'm afraid there's only one way to ask that question. What is the net cost or the net benefit of EU membership? And I think the net would very definitely be both an economic benefit, but we far too often count things just in pounds and pence. We also need to think about what the splitting of families, the stress, the worry that so many people experiences, the loss of opportunities for our young people. There's so many costs that we're bearing as a result of not being a member of the EU. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the point that came up when the Erasmus Plus deal was announced. There was a lot of fixation on the hundreds of millions of pounds that were going to be invested, but it is an investment, and really the return on that, and particularly the opportunities for young people in seriously deprived areas, is something that is very difficult to really put monetary value on. So it's not really just all about brass tacks. I may just come to our other speakers just for to answer the same. David, what do you think would the cost of membership be?
Well, it's that isn't, rejoining isn't the issue that we face at the moment, but I mean, it is worth going back to, when we were members and the campaign that was waged about how much we contributed, and you do have to look at the overall economic impacts. And yes, we would, if we were net contributors to the EU, but what we got from that was access to markets that was of very considerable value to the UK economy. So the real issue is what has been the cost of leaving the European Union for the UK. And Emma, you referred to the OBR numbers. There's been some work by American academics suggesting that the cost may have been even greater than that. And I think we do have to face up to the fact that that was a decision that has been economically disadvantageous to the UK at a time when there are plenty of other economic headwinds. So it has clearly not been a helpful decision for us.
No, great. Thanks, David. Final word to Richard, and then we will wrap up.
Well, back at the referendum, a number of us did make the point at that point we had a rebate, of course, which
yes.
I think we'd be very fortunate to get that back. But look, I think in terms of everyone's asking us to look to have our crystal balls out and look to the future. We just don't know these things. But I think in terms of the here and now and closer ties, I mean, we've talked about the economic benefits of the deals which we're already striking, and then Erasmus Plus, for example, and I think it was the case that Universities UK showed that the benefits of being economically of being in Erasmus were actually equivalent to or more than the cost of being in Erasmus. And there's example after example of that. So in terms of closer ties and working more closely with Europe, the real question is, what's the cost of not doing that?
Absolutely, great point. Thank you so much, Richard. So yes, with that, I think it's time to wrap up for this evening. A huge thank you to my guests, David GAUKE, Richard Baker MP, and Baroness Natalie Bennett. It's been really interesting to hear all of those insightful contributions. 2026 is looking to be another challenging and exciting year for the European movement and pro-Europeans in general. I hope we've injected a little bit of hope and excitement for the year ahead, and I look forward to seeing you back here in a year's time when we can look back on even more wins and even more positive changes to the UK-EU relationship as we hopefully head towards our ultimate goal of being back where we belong in the EU. So thank you very much for joining us, and have a great evening.